This is a CBC podcast.
Typically, urban fire services, urban cities don't need to contemplate wildfires, but we do.
Hey, I'm Claire Bonnyman, and this is Edmonton, a local podcast from CBC News. We are officially into wildfire season, and already thousands of people have been evacuated from their homes in northern Alberta. There are states of emergency in other prairie provinces, and a prediction of hot, dry weather that could mean another brutal season. And while we don't often see wildfires hit the biggest cities in our province, what is the risk of wildfire here in Edmonton? And if one starts, do we have a plan to put it out? CBC's Tanera McLean has been digging into this story for the last couple of weeks and joins me now to get into it. Hello, Tanera.
Hi, Claire.
So what does the city's wildfire plan look like?
Okay, so I looked for a little while. You know, we do our reporting. I was not actually able to find a fully detailed plan publicly. I asked the city if they had a plan, and if so, can they share it with me? After a few email exchanges, they sent me a memo that was shared with the city council back in February. And that memo was just updating what the general approach would be for 2025 to mitigate wildfire risk and manage and respond to wildfire should something happen here in the city. The memo has four main pillars that were outlined: prevention and mitigation. Another was preparedness. Another was response. And then the last one was recovery. The memo says they are doing assessments to identify potential risks for wildfire here in the city. In March, they were supposed to bring different levels of government agencies like Alberta Health Services and city park rangers together to practice a wildfire response. They hired a wildfire technician to help manage risk, and they're developing an AI tool called EmberWise to help detect risk. Now, this memo isn't actually very detailed with any order of steps they'll take in the event of a response. It gives mostly general information about the work they're doing or have done under the four pillars of this response. The city, though, did hold a press conference last month at the new Rapid Emergency Support Terminal, which is over by the old airport where all that construction's happening.
Yeah.
So it's a semi-permanent location for a reception center that can support evacuees who live here in Edmonton and people from other places who need to evacuate their homes and they need a savior city here in Edmonton. At this press conference, Claire, the city also gave an update about their broader wildfire plans. This is what Edmonton Fire Chief David Lazenby had to say about the city's preparedness for a wildfire situation.
I think the key to say is Edmonton's prepared. You know, I've said a number of times in public settings, we're a city in transition and a fire service in transition. Typically, urban fire services, urban cities don't need to contemplate wildfires, but we do. You know, we're blessed to have the river valley and, you know, the thousands of hectares that we get to enjoy, but we also recognise the risk in these changing times. And so we're making plans to ensure that should something happen, we're prepared to respond.
So the chief went on to talk about programs the city has about preparedness, like the Get Ready in the Park event that happened earlier this spring, Fire Smart, which we've been hearing a lot about in the past few years, and also following rules about fire pits and fireworks.
Really familiar stuff, right? Like these are the things that every spring they come around, big PSAs, only you can prevent wildfires, right?
Yes. Now, those really are mostly about individual residents being prepared themselves and doing their bit to help out the greater good. But the question I really wanted to answer here was, how is our municipal government itself organizing with their available resources on behalf of the people who live here? Earlier this year, city administration said they are making a wildfire strategy as part of Edmonton's broader emergency management plan. This wildfire strategy is supposed to be ready by early next year. That's what they've said. But in the absence of a detailed response plan to actually look at, I decided I would reach out to several experts with different wildfire emergency response expertise to see what they think should actually be in this response plan.
Because it's a different kind of response, right? In a city, there's so many homes, there's buildings, lots of concrete, which is not necessarily what we've seen in some of the recent fires that have hit communities. So is it even still considered a wildfire if it's here in our urban space?
It is, and there's some nuance here. So wildfire situation here would be classified as a technical term, wildland urban interface situation. That's what it would be. So that is a technical way of saying you have lots of homes and buildings bordering or intermixed with areas of trees, shrubs, and grass that have not yet been developed. So think about the river valley, where it kind of meets up to the homes when it gets up those steep cliffs, or ravines near human buildings, or even homes near large parks, and neighborhoods at the edge of the city across from open grassy fields.
Gotcha. The city has addressed managing some of those risks to the river valley, right? Is that where where most of this response plan should be focused?
And going into this, we think the River Valley is the closest thing we have to a forest. So logically, yeah, it makes sense to start there. Several times during the press conference last month, Chief Lazenby and City Manager Eddie Robar, they mentioned a lot of proactive work being done to spot and limit wildfire risk there in the River Valley. But I spoke to Rick Swan, who has a lot of experience with the wildland-urban interface. Now, he's retired from an organization called the International Association of Firefighters, and he currently works with the Wildfire Conservancy in California. Swan pointed out to some scenarios where wildfire did affect major cities, like Los Angeles earlier this year, and another smaller fire situation in Boston. And he says that while, yes, the River Valley is a large park full of trees and there is a serious risk there, with larger metropolitan areas, wildfires rarely start in the middle of a city. Instead, they typically start on the outskirts or move in from the suburbs and creep along toward the middle as it spreads.
More than likely, because it have its momentum, they don't come from downtown. Now, when you have high winds and you have a single-family dwelling on fire, you could be putting up a lot of embers. You get embers that are cast. When you have high winds and low humidities, the things go up in the air. The ember cast falls out, a half a mile down the line and starts falling on things. And it just keeps growing exponentially.
Claire, I do have to say that there is a caveat here.
Okay.
Swan says because sometimes human-made fire are started in the deeper brush of a city, so some of those urban parkland areas, that can become a larger problem for a place like the River Valley.
Okay.
But from his professional experience, he says the city of Edmonton's plan should include the notion that offense around the perimeter of the city, maybe the first line of defense actually, and there should be a clear understanding of where fire situations are and where to deploy firefighter equipment to battle near the outskirts at the beginning of a fire event. And he also says this is where firefighters need to be trained to understand how a fire moves through an urban landscape, rather than a typical urban fire that can engulf a single building in just one spot. There is a difference.
There's a huge difference. My brother-in-law is actually a firefighter.
Okay,
and I remember hearing him talk about just the different levels of education. And of course, wildfire, completely different. So how are these firefighters trained? What did you learn about how that training fits into a response plan in Edmonton?
I had to talk to a couple of different people, but Swan did say he and the International Association of Firefighters actually developed a training program back in 2016 called Responding to the Interface. It's a 2-day program for urban firefighters to learn how to manage the wildland-urban interface. Now, the government of Canada has actually allocated at least I could find, $800,000 to give this training to various municipalities across the country. Swan says an issue they saw in Fort McMurray back in 2016 was that the firefighters were doing what they were traditionally trained to do. They mostly anchored into a hydrant and tried to fight the fire generally from one spot. But because, like we were saying, wildfire moves through a landscape, firefighters have to be able to move with that fire as well. This is what the wildland-urban interface training is supposed to fix. So Swan says the city needs to have a good contingency of firefighters who can do this as well. And there is documentation that the city has offered that training to some of their firefighters.
Okay, so it's been offered. So do Edmonton firefighters have this kind of training?
For context, we'll start there with a bit of context. The city has about 1,100 full-time firefighters on their roster. At the press conference last month, I asked Chief Lazenby how many of those firefighters have wildland training and when the training started, and this is what he told me.
We've given wildland training to our firefighters and we're continuing to evolve that training program. It's been ongoing for the last number of years and continuing.
That's not really a definitive answer.
No.
Lazenby did mention, though, that Edmonton Fire is in transition right now. He took over the fire chief job maybe about a year ago or so. The city is training firefighters specifically for this wildland-urban interface, and the training is supposed to start in March this year and finish by fall next year. That is what some documentation from the city says. But Claire, another aspect I was able to get some clarity on is what kind of firefighting resources the city really has. So I said 1,100 firefighters in the city.
Yeah.
At any given time, the chief said about 250 of them are on duty around the city. And the city also has about 56 fire pumps and other apparatus. Earlier, we heard Rick Swan say that an issue with the wildland-urban interface is the need to move with this fire rather than anchor into a hydrant and stay just in one place. In Edmonton, the fire pumps are not necessarily designed to move around easily. They're very, very large. We've all seen them on the streets.
Yeah.
So a logical question is, what kind of equipment should be included in this wildfire wildfire response plan to make it easier for firefighters to move with this fire, right?
Mm-hmm. When we talk about it, obviously, we're moving away from hydrants. So what kind of equipment would actually make a difference in this kind of situation?
Another person I spoke to who was able to give me some clarity was somebody named Chris Livham. He's a Canadian registered safety professional and the owner of Arctic Fire Safety Services. Chris helped respond to the wildfires in Jasper last year, and he says the wildland-urban interface type of fire needs several different kinds of vehicles being used all together in different ways because the larger trucks we have here in the city can't do all of the jobs necessary in a wildfire situation.
Because they're not designed to pump and roll, which means if you have a lot of spot fires happening, they're not well designed to deal with all the spot fires that are happening. So if you're seeing a lot of spot fires, you'd have the smaller brush trucks going ahead to deal with the spot fires, and you would have larger engines like what Edmonton has anchoring in place. So this way, if the big wildfire is coming, they're able to start wetting down the area of the fire to try and wet down the fields before that big wildfire gets there. As well, you'd have a lot of tenders in there trying to help keep all the engines full of water because you're not relying on the hydrant system. You're trying to find alternative ways of keeping water to those fire trucks.
I'll give you just a bit of terminology there because they use some words you might not be familiar with. Livham says a brush truck is basically a pickup truck, a larger pickup truck with a water tank on it. And a tender is a larger vehicle that can transport water. There is, Claire, some documentation from the city that says we do actually have access to some of these resources if we really do need them for that wildland-urban interface situation here in the city.
Okay, so there are millions of podcasts, and maybe you're cool to stick with the ones you already know you like. But if you're just a little paranoid about missing out on the best new stuff, we can help. Every other Thursday, the Sounds Good newsletter will bring you one must-hear show from CBC Podcasts. And because we're true audio nerds, we'll also tell you about shows that we love that we didn't make. Go to cbc.ca/soundsgood to subscribe.
There are so many elements to any fire response, right? So far, we've covered where the fire might start, some of the equipment we need. What about the human aspect of this? If someone actually needs to leave their home here in Edmonton, what happens?
That's a tough situation. We're seeing it right now with all the wildfires, all the evacuation orders across the country. A lot of people mobilizing and moving. That human element is hard to really pin down in this response plan that I'm looking for. I couldn't find anything that lays out a plan for how people would be evacuated. And the memo the city shared earlier this year didn't have those details either. As for where those evacuees would go, the city says it's working to renew a contract with the Red Cross this year to help with sheltering evacuees if necessary. They also have mutual aid agreements with other places, including the provincial government and other cities. That just means that if there is a situation, those jurisdictions and those agencies will come help us if we do need that help. And likewise, we do have those kinds of contracts with other places as well. So we will offer that help.
Right.
Historically, Edmonton has been a savior city in those mutual agreements. We have been a host city for evacuees from other parts of the province, which actually brings up another piece of response that's really important to look at. And I didn't really quite think about this until I pulled the thread a little bit more about how this really is impacting humans. Think about evacuees from past wildfires and the shelter required to house them while displaced.
Right.
And the scale of shelter needed if a city as large as Edmonton were required to evacuate. And with such a large-scale evacuation for so many people, having a reliable, centralized source of accurate information really is key. We've seen time and again in these natural disaster situations where erroneous information is being shared on social media and people start to work off of bad information, which I guess can become a risk in and of itself.
Absolutely.
And it may not seem totally obvious at first, but making a clear plan for how information is shared is actually part of preparing to manage a population's mental health in this kind of crisis. I spoke to Dr. Janine Hubbard about this. Dr. Hubbard is a registered psychologist who has worked with victims of natural disaster situations. She says a lot of mental health in a natural disaster focuses on control. We are humans. We do like to feel a degree of control over what's happening to us. And how much control do the victims have over how they're moving through this wildfire event and how has that affected their day-to-day lives? Hubbard says that any wildfire response plan should factor in that the need for professional therapy is not actually during or even right after an event.
And it's interesting because that's often when we mobilize emergency responses and say, oh, look, we've got counselors on the ready. And for the most part, people are still in just survival mode. So early on, kind of the first 4 to 6 weeks, we fully expect to see things like tearfulness, disrupted sleep, perhaps increased substance use, hypervigilance. It's only once all of that starts to settle that a lot of the responses come along. But if you haven't seen things resolve at about that 4 to 6 week mark, and the rest of life has stabilized, either you're back in your home or you're reestablishing something, that's when the let's reach out for some help and maybe some better coping strategies, or how do I manage the hypervigilance? How do I manage some of the trauma symptoms?
Speaking to Dr. Hubbard was really fascinating because she was putting together a lot of bits and pieces that I guess we don't think about until something happens.
Yeah.
And Hubbard says a lot of this is a fundamental shift in the way we treat mental health in a large population dealing with disasters, because wildfire season comes around every single year, and some triggers like smoke or hearing emergency alerts can send people back into crisis mode. So they may need ongoing therapy long after a situation happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's say a fire happens. So that initial event is over. We've talked about what people might need after, but what does the city do to move forward, especially if we're in that process of potentially rebuilding?
After an event, we are hoping we learn some lessons. Something happens, we learn from it, and we do a better job. And we gather information to help us prepare in the future in case something happens again, or even, maybe we can stop it from happening again. This is the kind of work that Glenn McGilvray does. He's managing director for the Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction here in Canada.
What a title.
That is a very long title, and it means something pretty specific.
Yeah.
So this organization, they're funded by insurance companies, and they work to figure out how to prevent loss from happening because of climate change and severe weather. McGilvray says one of the key words they use in his line of work is resilience or resiliency. This is the idea that you can recover from something because you take preventative steps to minimize the overall damage an event can cause. And he says that a clear, articulated response plan with clear details is where this resiliency can start.
When a community is hit by a wildfire, there's a litany, a long list of things that have to be done. For example, after a wildfire, you have to do things like remove debris. Nobody really has a written plan of how this can be done. What's the best practice? We have to remediate the soil because there's a lot of toxins in soils after a wildfire. If you can imagine things like vinyl siding and all the things that are in homes melting down into the soil, all the plastics and fuels and stuff like that. Nobody has a plan on how to do that. And then, if a community loses 500 homes, they have to have a plan of rebuilding those homes. And so they have to issue building permits in a mass way. Nobody has a plan on how to do that. As those homes are being built, they have to be inspected. Nobody has a plan on how to inspect a huge number of homes in a short period of time. The list goes on and on and on. Every community faces these after a fire. Nobody has a plan on how to do it. And so we grab for straws, we waste time, and then you have communities that are basically unbuilt 2 years after the fact.
That was also really fascinating, Claire. I never considered having to approve 500, 1,000 building permits, right?
All in one go.
Absolutely. And McGilvray also says that building back better is really important, and that's kind of what he's talking about. He sees cities trying to build back very, very quickly, which makes sense. People want to come home and go back to a normal life. But he says not enough time is put into finding better materials and systems that will prevent the same kind of catastrophic loss. He gives vinyl siding as an example. In Fort McMurray, he said some homes that were destroyed were rebuilt with vinyl siding again, which means they're not resilient enough for another wildfire event. Ultimately, Claire, McGilvray says it's not uncommon for his agency, though, to see that municipalities don't have a very clear, defined wildfire response plan written down on paper. He says municipalities usually have an ad hoc response, which is expensive and keeps people out of their homes longer. So a lot of work needs to be done to address this in the coming years to make sure places are ready in case they are, unfortunately, the next Jasper, Fort McMurray, or Slave Lake.
Yeah. I mean, Tanera, this is something that's crossed my mind living in Edmonton. I have distinct memories of some summers during fire season, even just looking across the horizon and you see brush fires that have popped up around town. You spent all day reporting on it. What is sticking with you as someone who lives here too after you dug into all of this and all of the work that's happening?
I think something that is relevant in this reporting, but we can also maybe see in our own lives, is that we always think we're ready for something until it happens, and then we're like, I could have been more prepared for this. And like McGilvery was saying, every single expert I talked to for this just made the point of we need to put a lot of time into thinking about what we would do at every single stage of something like this happening, so that we're not caught flat-footed, and learning from other jurisdictions as well, and learning from other places who've gone before us, who have unfortunately given us lessons, and realizing that details matter in this kind of thing, and a broad idea is not enough. You really do have to plan, which is what the city says they are. They're making an effort to have some detailed plans ready.
Well, I know all the work you put into exploring all the various routes that this story has gone down. Thank you so much for bringing it to us.
You're welcome, Claire. Thanks for having me.
This is Edmonton is a local podcast from CBC News. Our technician this week is Corey Haberstock. Our senior producer is Leslie Goldstone, and I'm Claire Bonnyman. And thanks so much this week to Tanera McLean for all their reporting, plus the work of our colleagues covering this fire season so far. This is Edmonton is recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering place of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. You can email us a question, comment, or a story idea at thisisyeg@cbc.ca. Leave us a rating or a review wherever you download the show, and you can always find us wherever you get your podcasts.